In this video, we'll discuss the recently ended ceasefire that has erupted again, reigniting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Thanks to China's efforts as the president of the UN Security Council and the global pressure and mediation from various countries, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict managed a rare ceasefire for a few days. However, this ceasefire was merely a superficial relief for the international community and was never sustainable. Why unsustainable? It's straightforward. The conflict between Israel and Hamas is irreconcilable, a matter of life and death. Setting aside deeper conflicts, this recent clash was a matter of survival for both sides. Israel aims for absolute control over Gaza, seeking to expand its territory, a proposition Hamas would never accept. How could a lasting ceasefire be achieved when international demands for ceasefire contradict Israel's intention to occupy Gaza entirely? Unless faced with an insurmountable obstacle, at least for now, Netanyahu is unlikely to back down. Against this backdrop, on the morning of December 1 local time, the Israeli military declared that due to Hamas violating the temporary ceasefire agreement and launching rockets into Israeli territory, they had resumed attacks on Hamas in the Gaza Strip. When one side wants to fight, any excuse suffices. When one wants peace, there's no way to fight. Therefore, Israel's reasons are just excuses to reignite conflict. Frankly speaking, from the announcement of a 4-day ceasefire on November 24, extended until December 1, nearly a week's time, this was a relatively good outcome for the initial ceasefire. However, Israel's hostage exchange was a mere facade. While releasing 210 Palestinian prisoners, they arrested over 260 Palestinians in the West Bank, outnumbering those released. Yet, the real focus isn't just the rekindled conflict, it's the unusual confrontation between the United States and Israel, as reported in the media. On November 30 local time, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken visited Israel to discuss extending the ceasefire and increasing humanitarian aid to Gaza. Blinken, in a post-meeting press conference, stated that while the ceasefire freed hostages and expanded humanitarian aid to Gaza, it wasn't nearly enough. He emphasized further appeals to relevant countries to take action. Blinken, as the U.S. messenger, came to discuss extending the ceasefire, but Israel resumed conflict the very next day, giving him no face. Ultimately, Blinken could only mitigate his embarrassment by stressing the need to minimize civilian casualties among innocent Palestinians before restarting operations. What can he do? Israel isn't listening. Even if Israel acts recklessly, the U.S. dares not take severe actions against them. Hence, after their meeting, Blinken could only reiterate unwavering support for Israel. Regarding Blinken's visit, Israeli media revealed a bombshell. Blinken allegedly rebuked Israel in a wartime cabinet meeting, instructing them not to conduct military operations in southern Gaza, causing civilian casualties on the scale seen in the north and implying Israel had only weeks, not months, to execute its plan to destroy Hamas, urging a change in tactics in southern Gaza. The credibility of this revelation in the Israeli media? It's doubtful. Did Blinken really dare to rebuke Israel? That's an exaggeration. It's safe to say Blinken didn't possess such courage. So, was the assertion that Blinken prohibited Israel from causing massive civilian casualties in southern Gaza true or false? Such a statement is possible from the U.S., but it's merely an assertion. What the U.S. says, Israel won't necessarily heed. It's a mutual understanding between the two, although not necessarily desired by the U.S. Reports mentioned that the U.S. attempted to pressure Israel on post-Gaza war governance, only to face Prime Minister Netanyahu's outright rejection, resulting in an atmosphere of unusual confrontation throughout the meeting. This alleged unusual confrontation was a show for others. It wasn't genuine. As for the so-called hint that Israel has only a few weeks, not months, to complete its alleged plan to destroy Hamas, it's not something the U.S. said to Israel. Rather, it's addressed to the international community. The purpose of saying this is to shift blame so that Israel's actions can't be blamed on the U.S. However, the reality is that not only did the U.S. provide the weapons for these Israeli massacres, but they also sent aircraft carriers to escort Israel's invasion of Gaza and continually vetoed ceasefire proposals in the Security Council. In fact, this visit didn't serve Blinken's supposed political aims at all. Israel couldn't care less about the supposed few weeks timeframe, and they immediately contradicted the US. According to the December 1st report from the Financial Times citing several anonymous sources, Israel is planning a year-long or even longer campaign against Hamas, aiming to kill 3 top Hamas leaders. Specifically, the most intensive ground assault by the Israeli military will continue until early 2024, extending into southern Gaza. After the primary ground operations, there will be a lower-intensity transition and stabilization phase to prepare for post-war order. You've seen how the news is worded, right? Frankly, the preceding reasons were excuses. The real goal is to infiltrate southern Gaza after the ground assault ends, followed by this so-called transition and stabilization phase, all aimed at establishing the so-called post-war order. What is this post-war order? Plainly put, it's the order over Gaza completely controlled by Israel. Isn't this a blatant invasion? This is completely contrary to what the US is saying, which perfectly demonstrates that those statements by the US aren't meant for Israel but for the international community, indicating that the US has made efforts but can't prevent these actions. However, the reality is that the US has consistently supported Israel's actions. Without US support, where would Israel get the capability for such massive slaughter of Palestinians? If you observe closely, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, almost the entire world stands against Israel, with the US being one of the very few supporting countries. Within Western countries, nations like Spain, Ireland, Belgium, among others, have fiercely criticized Israel and even called for sanctions. Internally in the US, forces including some influential figures like Musk have also intensely criticized Israel. It's because of this pressure that the US is currently in a dilemma. On one hand, the US must support Israel. It's both determined by the US's national interests and because of the immense influence of Jewish lobbyists in the US. On the other hand, the US genuinely doesn't want Israel to escalate the conflict too much because the US's true target of contention is China, and an escalated Israel-Palestine conflict would divert the US from its target. Lastly, supporting Israel puts the US against almost the entire world, which is probably a first since its founding. For the US, this is an extreme challenge. It's precisely based on this logic that, objectively speaking, Israel has harmed US national interests. Looking from the perspective of the US government, there are indeed reasons for the US to use force against Israel and push Israel to make concessions. Of course, given the US's national power, it certainly has the ability to do so. It's for these reasons that some experts believe the US will eventually act against Israel for the sake of its national interests, compelling Israel to compromise on the Israel-Palestine issue. Next, Israel will inevitably continue its military operations, and the US will inevitably have no choice but to support. Hence, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict won't come to an end anytime soon. Instead, more countries and their forces will undoubtedly be drawn into this conflict. This is entirely foreseeable. Blinken warns Israeli officials that the longer the war lasts, the greater the global pressure. But that's the US perspective. However, considering Israel's objective of occupying Palestine, how could it be a short-term action? Therefore, the global power play regarding the Israeli-Palestinian issue is underway. Who suffers the most from the outbreak of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? The unfortunate ones are probably in Ukraine. Because there's virtually no support from the US and the West, Russia is poised to act against Ukraine. Putin is likely to seize this opportunity to further expand westward. This is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment. We genuinely appreciate your support.